Dr. Allison McGovern is an anthropological archaeologist in the greater New York City area whose work integrates archaeology with historical research methods, public engagement, planning, and historic preservation advocacy. She is a Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation Fellow at City University of New York's Gotham Center for New York City History, and is currently working on a project entitled Long Island Dirt, which will be her topic today. I'd like to introduce Dr. Allison McGovern.
Thank you. Thanks, Ellen. And thank you all for welcoming me here today. You know what, I wanted to also add that in addition to being a writing fellow at the Gotham Center, I'm also a professional archaeologist with a cultural resources firm called Richard Grubb and Associates, which works out of New Jersey, but I'm bringing in the New York work. And so I'm talking to you as a professional in the field who's been working in archaeology for quite a long time. I'm really happy to be here to speak with you all about my work. And I'm in the writing process of this manuscript called Long Island Dirt. That kind of feels ambitious, but is really a personal approach to understanding the many histories and pasts that make up this place called Long Island. I'm just going to hide your faces for now. So Long Island is a place that many of us call home, and it's a place that is rich in diverse histories, peoples, and narratives. And for those of us who live here, we know what it means to have neighbors, to be part of a community. And we know, even though we often can't define it, that our identities as Long Islanders are shaped by the region in which we live and how our communities are defined in relation to each other. So frequently people talk about the North Shore versus the South Shore, or Suffolk County versus Nassau County, not to mention Brooklyn and Queens, which are geographically a part of Long Island, though some would argue that cultural aspects really strongly differentiate Brooklyn and Queens from Suffolk and Nassau counties. All of this is to say that Long Island identity is tied up within a series of boundaries and relationships that are not so easily understood from outsiders. And this interests me as an anthropologist and a historian. I'm interested in how our understanding of the present can be informed by the past. So my goal for this project, called Long Island Dirt, is to use archaeological data from particular locations or microhistories to build place-based narratives, or narratives that are specific to certain areas. And then I'm going to attempt to tie those microhistories or narratives into some big picture discussions of Long Island history, because I think this will also shed light on how we as contemporary Long Islanders relate to each other, to the island, and to the region. And so I chose to show you this map here from 1863, because I think it's interesting in the way it shows how the towns were bound up, with these in relation to each other. And it's before the separation, it's before the creation of Nassau County, and it's before the creation of New York City. So you really sort of get this sense of how towns are divided between each other and like carved up into these locales. But a lot of the activity that took place, certainly in the 19th century, as it does today, forced people to cross over those boundaries. And so people were relating to people in other communities through work, through kin connections, through travel from one place to another. And so this really contributes to a sense of a sense of community identity, but also a sense of collective identity. So archaeology provides important method for understanding lived experiences at the micro or place-based level. And I in particular do historical archaeology. And historical archaeology relies on multiple lines of evidence, and some of those sources are illustrated here. So in addition to the recovery of artifacts and what we call features at archaeological sites, we also use several other resources that are used in history as well. So For instance, on the upper left, I'm showing a picture of me in the field digging with shovels and trowels, right? So this is the actual activity of digging in the dirt. Sometimes we also use machine assistance through backhoe operation at a site. But we also, in addition to moving dirt, we use these other kinds of resources, such as historic maps, one of which is depicted here in the lower part of the screen. And we'll use historic maps to see if there's evidence of something like a historic farmstead or a building, which might provide clues that there's archaeological traces associated with that building. Sometimes those maps will also have ownership or occupation associated with the structure. So we can take that information and consult with the federal census data to get a sense of how many people live there, what they did for work, and how they are identified by government officials. And so I have a picture of, I think this is like an 1840 census sheet right in the center of the screen. For more specific economic information, we often consult account books or diaries if they're available. Sometimes these are available in the special collection sections of our local libraries or at local historical societies. And so on the right, you see a picture of a photo of an account book that I used in the East Hampton Library. And another very important, though too often overlooked resource is interviews and conversations with descendants and local residents, various stakeholders who might have information about the people who lived at the site. So not all archaeological sites receive equal attention in terms of research. And the other thing that I would like to note here is that the bulk of archaeological research that's done in this country is done for compliance purposes, often as part of a series of environmental reviews. And so that's why I pointed out in the beginning that I also work for a firm that does archaeology on a professional scale, because that's the kind of work that typically is done if a building is going to be built in an area that requires environmental review. We follow state and local laws and research whether there's archaeological traces there before the building gets built. This is often done in areas where you need permits or approvals for building near wetlands. And it's all dictated by New York State and federal laws, sometimes local planning boards in some of the East End towns. And the work is typically phased. So we'll start with like a phase 1, then we'll proceed to a phase 2 or a 3 if there's, if there's archaeological sites identified in the process. So most archaeologists in the country are employed in this kind of work, which is called cultural resources management, rather than academic positions, which is what people typically think archaeologists are working as. Most of the archaeological research that we do in phased work gets buried in what we call the gray literature. So it gets written up in a report, and then the report gets submitted to the State Historic Preservation Office. And most of the time, the public doesn't even know that the research was done, in their neighborhood. So my main purpose with this project, Long Island Dirt, is to highlight some of the research that's generated through contract archaeology and share it in this book. And try to connect the kinds of research that we do on a micro scale at these archaeological sites with a more regional understanding of Long Island history. So what I have on the screen here is on the right, a picture of the State Historic Preservation Office's archaeological site file search, which is a website called the Cultural Resources Information System. And so you could go into the CRIS system and you can identify historic sites that have been listed on the National Register or that have been determined eligible for listing. And if we have time later on, I'm going to show it to you, especially in relation to the Brentwood area, so you can see what's documented in terms of historic and what might be missing. Okay, so I chose the title Long Island Dirt because I thought it was a fun play on words. Obviously, as an archaeologist, I work, or some people would say I play in the dirt. I use a method that requires digging holes in trenches to recover artifacts that are preserved in the dirt for hundreds or sometimes even thousands of years. And so, for instance, on the left, you see a picture of some quartz flakes recovered from dirt in Setauket. And these were the residue of stone tool manufacture. So these date to several thousands of years old. And on the right is a picture of a more recent investigation that I was involved in Huntington in January. And this was in the yard of a historically Black home called the Crippen House site. And we're recovering lots of 19th century ceramics and other artifacts associated with the Crippen family's lived experience at the site. So, so I chose the title Long Island Dirt because I thought it would be fun to talk about dirt in this, interesting way. But also I think it's fun to think about the word dirt as used for talk or gossip. So, people like to talk dirt like about stories about people. So I feel like I'm playing with this idea of narrative related to specific sites. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with the kinds of work that I have done and have written about, I like to challenge the dominant narrative in the research that I do through archaeology. So I'm interested in alternative ways of exploring the past and shedding light on the lives of people who've been marginalized in historical narratives. So in a way, I feel like I'm generating new dirt on people, and this becomes evocative when you think about what archaeologists are actually exploring, which is the trash deposits of past peoples in something called middens, which is a fancy word for a garbage dump, or even in privies, which is what you see pictured on the right, if we're lucky, which if you think about it, if you think about your own household trash, can really reveal some quite personal things about how we live our lives. But that's really the most fruitful places that we can investigate through archaeology are people's garbage. So on the left, you see some artifacts recovered from sifted dirt at the Fowler House in East Hampton. And these were things that were lost or discarded by the people who lived inside of in the Fowler House. And on the right is a possible outhouse behind a 19th century house in Sag Harbor. And I say possible because I haven't had the opportunity to investigate this outhouse. So I don't know if there's any intact privy shaft below, but typically inside a privy shaft, you would find what's called night soil. And you would also find trash that people would throw out, like broken pieces of ceramic or bottles, which were just useless. So they threw them down the privy hole along with human waste. And there's been some studies of the night soil of privies to detect information about health and parasites in a human's past. So in thinking about Long Island dirt, one thing that I didn't really consider until recently was how to visualize Long Island dirt. And there's so many different landscapes to consider. I chose this photo, which I took at Terrell River County Park in Santa Mauritius, because I just thought it was a really, sort of a really powerful image of, maritime forest right up against the shoreline, these really tough trees growing through the soft white sand. And it's just one idea of a really challenging landscape that Long Islanders have lived in, or, and continue to live alongside. So it was really interesting to start to think about what you think of when you hear Long Island dirt. Some people certainly think about that really rich brown dirt that we start to uncover about like 20 centimeters below the ground surface. But there's so many different landscapes, and it's interesting to think about how Long Islanders have adapted to those through time. So Long Island dirt is about exploring what we can learn from local sites through place-based narratives and place-based histories, and how those local narratives might be connected to other sites on Long Island. So developing a regional understanding of Long Island's past involves connecting people and places through time and space. And so in order to start thinking about that, I'm going to jump in with one case from Yaphank in the town of Brookhaven in Suffolk County. Let me see if it's going to show me. Okay, so we're highlighting the Yaphank area right there. Yaphank was an industrial center in the early to mid 19th century, and it was originally called Millville. It was because it was home to several mills that relied on water power from the Carmens River, which was dammed to create the lakes on which the mills were situated. Going to connect Yaphank up to the Oyster Bay area really quickly before connecting it to another location. But I wanted to point out these two areas because of kin connections. So local history in Yaphank surrounds James H. Weeks, who's pictured here alongside his wife, Mariah Weeks. James Weeks had moved to Millville from Oyster Bay in 1828. He married Susan Maria Jones of Oyster Bay in 1818, and they moved to Millville after they had purchased 9,000 acres of land in Wampmissick for a cordwood business from William Sidney Smith. William Sidney Smith is of the Tangier Smiths, some of the original proprietors of the town of Brookhaven. And William Sidney Smith at the time, was the owner of the Longwood estate. Smith had married James's wife's sister. So Smith married Eleanor Jones, also from Cold Spring Harbor, and they were living at the Smith estate at Longwood, which is north of Millville. Now, this is a map showing you the Wampmissick area. Wampmissick is not a name that people are familiar with today. It hasn't been used probably since the end of the 1800s, but it's this area that was signified by sort of a swampy woodland. And that's where one of the sites that I'm going to talk about today was located. So this is the 1858 map showing Wampmissick circled. And it's also showing one building that's owned by W.J. Weeks and two buildings owned by James H. Weeks. So, and let me see if I can do this. And it's connecting the Wampmissick area into the village settlement at Yaphank. So James was one of the original commissioners of the Long Island Railroad, and he was elected the director of the company in 1846. So the Yaphank and the Wampmissick area, in addition to Manorville, which is located just to the right, just to the east, were all intimately connected in the development of the railroad. So he served as the president of the Long Island Railroad from 1847 to 1850. In addition to his interest in railroad and farming and cordwood harvesting, he was also a part owner of the Homan Mill complex in Yaphank, which he owned with William Sidney Smith, who was his brother-in-law, and Robert Gerard. And that entire mill enterprise was built on the Carmens River. So James and Maria Weeks had one son named William J. Weeks. He was born in Oyster Bay in 1821, and then he moved with his family to Yaphank in 1828. He is the William J. Weeks that's shown on this 1858 map. So this dates to his time as an adult. Okay, now mid-19th century maps illustrate Yaphank as a really dense village over here on the left side of the screen. And that's where the homes of James Weeks and W.J. Weeks are, mapped across from each other in this red circle all the way to the left. James Weeks's home was called the Lilacs, and W.J. Weeks's home, which I'll talk about in a little bit, was called the Octagon because it was an octagon-shaped house. Now you can also see to the north is Longwood, the Longwood estate, and that's where William Sidney Smith and his wife, Eleanor, were living. And there was frequent travel between Longwood and the Weeks' homes in Yaphank. And what you also see highlighted are several rental properties throughout the Yaphank and Wampmissick areas. So the big circle is 3 properties owned by Weeks, the Weeks' father and son. Then there's several Smith properties, which are also outlined. And these are all they all connect the family through the 19th century. Some of these buildings are still standing, mainly the ones associated with the Smith family. And then the Weeks family buildings are more archaeological. So this is a picture of the Longwood Estate, which is owned by the town of Brookhaven, and you can visit it. This is one of Smith's rental properties on North Street in what's called today North Shirley, but it was Wampnissick at the time. And this was recently rediscovered by the Manorville Historical Society. This house that's just been built onto, which was originally a tenant's, it was a rental property that Smith rented to some of his laborers, either at the mill or, who worked for him in other capacities. And it's interesting that it's still hidden within this circa 1960s grid plan development. You wouldn't even know that it was there. Did I show you any? Okay. Okay, moving on. Now the Weeks properties, on the other hand, are no longer standing. So there's two sites here that I investigated archaeologically, probably like 15 years ago. And then there's an additional site over to the left, which is the Octagon House. And the Octagon House was built by W.J. Weeks in 1840s. So what you see here on the right is a picture of W.J. Weeks, or William J. Weeks, as an older gentleman riding his bicycle. He was very fond of bicycle riding and created a bicycle club in Yaphank. And on the upper left is another photograph of the Octagon House. And on the lower left are the archaeological remains of the Octagon House, which you can see is a granite stone foundation outlining the shape of an octagon. So the Octagon House was located roughly here, across the street from the Lilacs, which was his father's house, which is also no longer standing. So there was a connection that you could see through some of the documentary evidence that, of William Weeks traveling from this house over to the tenant's property's house to, keep up on affairs there. So I started paying attention to these sites in Yaphank through work that I had done at the Institute for Long Island Archaeology in 2005. And that's actually me on the left, a younger version of me. And we had conducted archaeological evaluations at two sites for Brookhaven National Lab in Upton. The sites were identified by lab personnel, but it was noted that one of them had been frequented by looters. And because the lab comprises federal property, the archaeological resources on the property are protected by the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, which was passed in 1979. That means that the unauthorized excavation and removal of archaeological materials from the federal property is a federal criminal offense. So the Institute for Long Island Archaeology was contracted to investigate the archaeological site, evaluate the boundaries, and evaluate the integrity of the sites and their eligibility for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. And then we made recommendations for how to secure and protect the site from further unauthorized destruction by looters. So we investigated two 19th century residential sites in the area that was once referred to as Wampnissick. Wampnissick was characterized as swampy woods and is illustrated on maps dating back to 1850s. And while those sites were owned by the Weeks family, they weren't inhabited by the Weeks family. So here you can see we're starting to excavate one of the sites where fieldstone foundation remains were found. And these are the foundation remains. So based on maps, census records, and other historic period documents, as well as the cultural material we recovered from the site, we learned that the house here, which is no longer standing, was referred to as the Yellow House by William J. Weeks. And it was built between 1830 and 1840, probably the very tail end of the 1830s. And then it looks like it was abandoned by about 1880, if not a decade earlier. Archaeology took place here in the summer of 2005, and we addressed the site by relying on visual clues when we got out there. We looked for things like the positions of remnant locust fence posts, a low stone wall, and piles of back dirt and that were left behind by looters. So when people were digging through, so they would dig a hole and then the dirt got thrown over on the side, and sometimes there were artifacts mixed in with that, and those were clues to, where the most promising portions of the archaeological site were located. And we used those visual clues to develop a testing strategy at the site. We also took into account things like orchard trees and remnants of ornamental plantings, which are also useful for orienting yourself when you're out in the fields, or orienting yourself at a former residential site. So a portion of the house foundation was recovered in the archaeological investigations, and that's what you see here, as well as a sheet midden, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a garbage dump. It's where people threw their trash during the historic period. And that was helpful for revealing traces of human lived experience. So a sheet midden is a kind of feature where you see artifacts are scattered across what was once the historic ground surface. So instead of people digging a hole, what they would do is they'd go out their back door and they would throw their, disperse their trash that way. And then, it would get spread around by maintenance of the yard space around the house. So during most of the period that the site was occupied, the house was inhabited by a tenant farmer and laborer named Edmund Ackerley and his family. Entries in Weeks's diaries suggest that the primary economic activity at the site was cordwood cutting, and the wood was sold as fuel to the Long Island Railroad, of which William's father, James Weeks, was one of the original commissioners. So this is another historic photograph of William Weeks on ice skates on a pond behind his house in Yaphank. But it also has on the screen some entries from Weeks's diary, which is a it's an incredibly useful resource for investigating the site. So he talks about Ackerley in his diary. He says, "I went to Wampmissick on horseback, called to see Ackerley, found him abed and not fully recovered from a drunken spree. His family is all absent, as it is said he turned them out on Monday nights," and that's dated 1852. But he also just, records some mundane activities like, fished the bucket out of the Yellow House well, replaced the broken light at the Yellow House. And these are all activities that could be associated with a cleaning episode after Ackerley had left the house. So William Weeks's diary provides periodic accounting of his cordwood business as well. And in 1851, he writes, "Father and I went in wagon to Wampmissick to select some place for Ackerley, my tenant, to begin to cut wood." He would travel to Wampmissick several times a week to meet with Ackerley, who was the cordwood farmer who worked for him. And based on the diary and a review of federal census data, it was Ackerley who was living in that house at the time, at the time of the 1858 map. This 1840 federal census shows Edmund Ackerley listed. He's highlighted here. He's employed in agriculture according to the census, and he's the head of a household comprising him, his wife, and 3 young daughters. By the time of the 1850 census, which you see pictured here, the Ackerley family had grown to include daughters Mary, Matilda, Jerusha, Harriet, and Angeline, and sons John and Louis, in addition to Edmund and his wife Julia. The 1850 census is the first one that documents everyone in a household by name, and also, their age and other information about like real estate value. So In 1850, he's still working for Weeks, and he's documented in that capacity in the Weeks diary. But what's interesting to think about is that we can, through documentary evidence, we can place Ackerley in this house in 1840. But at that time, William J. Weeks wasn't living in Yaphank. He was actually away at college. So when we think about these archaeological sites, we also have to take into account, generational information and what kinds of activities are happening at, within the other households that are directly impacted by the presence and the work of the tenant farmer Ackerley. So in terms of the archaeological data, we recovered 3,591 artifacts from the investigation, which took place over about a week. I think it was like 5 days in the field. And the artifacts include things like broken pieces of ceramics from tablewares, like you see here. These are these are broken pieces of plates and teacups. Some of them are hand painted. We call them polychrome hand painted because they have multiple colors used in the paint. We also found fragments of glass bottles and drinking vessels, but also glass from windows and chimney lamps. There were fragments of metal construction nails. There were also pieces of animal bone and shell representing discarded food items. There were personal items like buttons, jewelry, and fragments of smoking pipes. And all of these artifacts were recovered from the fill around the foundation and some from the sheet mitten behind the house. So these are some broken pieces of ceramics, and the scale is in there to show you how small some of these pieces of ceramics are that are recovered from the midden. And these are pieces of blue hand painted and polychrome painted pearlwares. They were probably pieces of teacups. These are pieces of redware, which were locally produced, which is really important for our understanding of the Weeks tenant site, because these would have been less expensive ceramics than the kinds of ceramics that were bought at stores that might be traveling through regional markets. Let's see. One of the things that was missing from the Weeks site was porcelains, which would have been, they would have been one of the higher end of ceramics that people could purchase through market. And so the absence of porcelains at the site really is it's an economic clue that maybe that people were, working class or didn't have some of the most expensive artifacts or wares. And these are pictures of the other kinds of artifacts that we recovered at the site. Pieces of metal utensils from dining, more pieces of redwares in the upper right. And redwares are used as utilitarian wares, like storage in the kitchen, sometimes baking wares, or like pie plates are made out of redwares. Whereas the more refined earthenwares that are like creamwares and pearlwares are the things that you would have on your table when you're serving people dinner. On the left, there's pictures of wine bottles, which are the dark glass, at the top of the photo, and the lower pieces would be pieces of stemware, like drinkware. Now, because the Ackerley family is pretty well documented in the Weeks diary in the 1850s, it's likely that these artifacts are associated with Ackerley's family and activities at the site. So Ackerley's activities outside of cordwood counts generally go unreported in Weeks's diary until 1853, when he makes that comment that I read earlier, that Weeks went to see Ackerley and found him at the house abed and still under the effects of a debauch. So it's interesting to think of some of these remains of wine bottles and other, alcohols recovered at the site being connected with that documented behavior by Ackerley. Ackerley's alcohol consumption apparently interfered with his work, and this did not go unnoticed in Weeks's diaries. He reported Ackerley's condition 4 times during his visits in just March and April of 1853. And I don't think that it's just that Ackerley's condition was interfering with cordwood production. William J. Weeks was also, he also didn't drink alcohol, or he actually didn't drink anything other than water. So there may be a bit of judgment also in writing about Ackerley's condition in his diaries. Now, by 1867, the Ackerley family was no longer living in the Weeks' rental property, and the house may have been occupied by a series of renters who are not well documented. I also mentioned earlier that there's entries in the diary that indicate like a cleaning episode was taking place. So it seems that that W.J. Weeks is getting the house prepared for new tenants to come in, which is interesting because from an archaeological perspective, we would expect to see something like a house cleaning episode, and we didn't find evidence of that at the site. What is interesting, though, is the economic contrast between the documented lives of Ackerley and the documented lives of the Weeks men, James Huggins Weeks and William J. Weeks. Weeks and his father were among Yaphank's most prosperous residents during the mid-19th century. According to census records, the value of his real and personal estates for William grew from $4,900 in 1860 to $15,000 in 1870. In contrast, Ackerley's family appears to have been of extremely modest means. For example, the 1850 and the 1860 censuses indicate that Ackerley did not possess any land or even personal estate, or at least nothing that was worth noting in the census. Now, William Weeks grew up an only child within a setting of business and industry and family and community in Yaphank. And we could see that when we talk about the connections between James Weeks, his father, and William Sidney Smith as being co-owners of the mills and being involved in various businesses with the railroads and with cordwood harvesting and sale. Meanwhile, William Weeks attended various schools in the region, and he worked as a civil surveyor before he left Long Island to study at Yale University in 1840. Now, while at Yale, he kept close contact with his parents through letters, some of which are preserved at the Yaphank Historical Society. His mother and father kept him abreast of their travels to Cold Spring Harbor and New York for family visits, but also for business. And they sometimes provided updates on James's progress with the railroad expansion through Yaphank and Wampmisset. William had returned to Yaphank by 1844-ish, and he married Mary Croswell. Mary is pictured here on the right, and William Weeks is pictured on the left. These are photos of them in their younger years. William was very civic-minded, and he was informed and influenced by modern philosophies of social reform and clean living. Many of these philosophies were influenced by the science of the times, which relied on a level of scientific racism that wasn't necessarily understood at the time. A means for validating the treatment of undesirables on the basis of race, sex, and other biological categories, which were believed to have predetermined capacities for civilized life and social and economic success. So these beliefs were integrated into the structure of community and the development of institutions of social reform that become a fundamental feature of the late 19th century. It's a period of science that's not necessarily self-reflective, and it folds into social reform in an interesting way where people in power are motivated to change existing systems, but not necessarily reflecting the science behind their ideals. And so as a consequence, there's a lot of biases that are generated against women, Native Americans, and people of color. And these scientific beliefs are also laying the groundwork for the eugenics movement, which was soon to come and whose origins of practice are very closely tied to the Long Island region and the Jones family of Cold Spring Harbor specifically. Now, when William returned home to Millville, he built this unusual home of octagonal shape, which he constructed around 1849. Octagonal houses gained widespread popularity in the mid-19th century following the publication of Orson Fowler's The Octagon House, A Home for All, which was originally published in 1848, with a second revised edition published in 1853. Orson Fowler, who I think is pictured, yep, here he is, he's pictured over here. Orson Fowler was a phrenologist, and which I'll talk about in a little bit, and he would promote the ideas of building an octagon house as he traveled from place to place in the same process of building his own octagon house in Fishkill, New York. So he's very much integrated into the 19th century history of New York State. He was a contemporary of social and medical reformers of the popular health movement at the time. And Fowler advocated for a variety of social reforms, including sex education, vegetarianism, and physical fitness. And it's really interesting to think about these ideals in relation to William J. Weeks, who was this very educated, Ivy League educated man who returned home and built an extraordinary house in a neighborhood where this was sort of an anomaly, but he also encouraged some of these ideas: vegetarianism, only drinking water, physical fitness with the creation of a bicycle club in Yaphank. So he really is tied into these social ideals at the time. Oh, you know what? I forgot to tell you. So this house is no longer standing. The house pictured here was destroyed by a fire in the first quarter of the 20th century. So now the house looks like this. We have the granite fieldstone remains of the Octagon House preserved in one of the parks in Yaphank. So this is the heart of the archaeological site, which was built in about 1848, 1849, right on the cusp of that architectural craze that impacted New York State in the 1850s. And Orson Fowler was a really big part of that. So the fashion of building octagon-shaped houses seems to be introduced by him, but it's certainly not new. There's a long history of octagon-shaped houses being built prior to this point. But he sort of markets it in this book that he calls A Home for All, where he states that octagon-shaped homes are more efficient to build, more efficient to heat, and more efficient to clean than traditional homes. The presence of windows on all sides and the absence of hallways, he argued, brought in fresh air and encouraged healthy living. And the plans for building octagon-shaped houses were available in this book, which is a treatise on the superior construction of octagon-shaped houses. He would speak at speaking engagements throughout the Northeast about this, and that's how he generated money to build his home in Fishkill. Meanwhile, he was also a phrenologist, which is what you see pictured here on the left is some of the imagery associated with phrenology, which is, you're probably familiar with this. It's the scientific idea that you can, that the shape of a person's head indicates their character and their mental capacity, their mental abilities. So Weeks's Octagon House was home to William and Mary and their 12 children, 8 of whom survived to adulthood. And this is just a really incredible picture that you can see here of the Octagon and some additions that were built on, which is a really interesting, it makes for an interesting case study of this site. So William was a well-read man and really thorough in his documentation. So he has 10 volumes of personal diaries that document his almost daily activities between 1851 and 1871. The originals are at the Queensborough Public Library, but they're scans on microfilm that are available at the Longwood Library. And according to these resources, William was involved in many of his father's businesses and was informed of his uncle Sidney's affairs as well. He appears to have been a gentleman farmer with large land holdings for, with large land holdings for vegetable crops. I lost my place, excuse me. And he was especially involved in asparagus cultivation. There's lots of pages in his diary that are just devoted to planting, harvesting, and sharing his asparagus. He was also an avid beekeeper. This occupied a lot of his time. He built and he sold hives, and he supplemented his income with surveying work as well. So he was busy farming, he was busy building hives, he was busy keeping bees. He had a mild obsession with the hexagonal shape of a beehive. So there's a lot of these fascination with geometrics and grids in Weeks's life. And I think this also makes sense with his work as a surveyor. He was active in creating a map of Wapmissick, but he was also active in outlining the boundary line between the towns of Huntington and Oyster Bay, which is interesting because that boundary line goes right through some of his ancestral lands, related to the Jones family. So what we learned from the diaries is that he and Mary were vegetarians who consumed no beverages other than water. They visited people in their community, invited people into their home for dinner and tea. And they also traveled a bit to family in Cold Spring Harbor and Oyster Bay. They visited a lot with their family in Longwood to the north. Weeks was undoubtedly influenced by Fowler's ideals, by the promotion of the octagon houses, and Fowler's plans proved really popular, in fact, with lots of scholars of math, philosophy, and theology. So it makes a lot of sense that Weeks would be so invested in some of these ideas. Excuse me, sorry. I don't know why it keeps flipping like that. So what's really interesting, though, is how the layout of his house and his property really coincide with Fowler's building plans, because Fowler's building plans in The Home for All, the book, include specifications for things like greenhouses and water pumps, but they don't necessarily maintain specifications for additions. And William and Mary's household grew pretty substantially with 8 living children at one point. So it's interesting to see to what extent the Weeks family followed Fowler's plans, or how they may have modified them to fit with the Weeks family lifestyle. So this archaeological site was first documented in the 1980s by the Long Island Archaeological Project, which was a predecessor of the Institute for Long Island Archaeology at Stony Brook University. They had prepared a phase 1 cultural resources survey for Suffolk County parks, and they identified this and many other archaeological sites that were within that county park. Then in 2017, I came back with a couple of field crew to do an archaeological survey of this Octagon Foundation. And it actually involved a couple of students, an undergraduate from Farmingdale State College and a graduate student from the CUNY Graduate Center, who was considering researching the site for her dissertation. And we were also assisted by professional archaeologist Mark Tweedy. And that survey project was developed in consultation with the Yaphank Historical Society and the Suffolk County Parks as sort of a pilot study to see, to what extent the archaeological resources could help us answer some of those questions about how the Weeks adapted to Fowler's plans. The archaeological survey involved the excavation of 39 shovel test pits. And shovel test pits are round holes that are dug with a shovel. All of the soil is screened through wire mesh to recover artifacts. Those shovel test pits were placed on a 5-meter grid, which is sort of close interval testing, just to make sure that we're not missing anything. And about 23 of those 39 shovel tests contained positive information related to the 19th and 20th centuries, the occupation era of the site. 2 test pits in particular may have encountered basement floors inside the foundation, which was really cool. And in addition, one shovel test pit located outside the foundation yielded information that might inform the building process at the site. So, we recommended that additional work be done around those positive shovel test pits to detect any additional archaeological features and the significance of what we found at the site. So the purpose of the investigation was really to look at the integrity of the foundation, see how much of it was intact, recover artifacts associated with Weeks family life in Yaphank, and to correlate the Octagon Foundation phenomenon with 19th century philosophies of social reform and popular health. So the archaeological investigations were intended to document the layout of the house and identify the placement of key utilities and activity spaces for comparison with something that we received from a descendant, which is pictured here, which is a sketch map of the layout and construction of one floor of the house, which is a really incredible resource. It's sort of like a memory map that can help us develop a testing strategy when we're in the field. We took a look at this and compared it with Orson's published construction plans as well. And all of these results provide a preliminary assessment of the structural remains and recommendations for more work at the site. One of the things that we didn't get to investigate, which I'd like to investigate in the future, is pictured here on the left, which is called the pump house or the pump room. And it's not clear if this was a part of the original construction of the house or if this was in a later addition, but it's really, really interesting in terms of understanding the importance of hydrotherapy in the public health movement and in the social reforms movement. So like clean water and water resources being incorporated into the household at this time is really early. And so it would be a really unique archaeological feature that we'd want to investigate in closer detail. So interpretation of the site, of course, benefits a great deal by the presence of Weeks descendants who are in contact with the Yaphank Historical Society and who share their memories, they share their photos, and they share material culture too with the Historical Society. So these are some turn of the century photographs of the interior of the Octagon House, which is also incredible that we have this level of documentation for a structure that's no longer standing. But in addition, the involvement of the Weeks family descendants with the Historical Society has brought about some really unique features to the Historical Society. So the family donates some of the, material culture or items associated with William J. Weeks. And so one of the really amazing things is the recovery of his ice skates pictured here in the lower left. It's not a great picture, but these are his ice skates. And we have that alongside documentation of him ice skating on the Weeks Pond behind his Octagon House. Now certainly there was this, certainly Octagon houses were built much earlier than the 1850s. And one really important example that needs to be understood in relation to this 19th century movement is the architectural type seen at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. But this architectural type is really strongly revived in the 1850s following Fowler's publication. And so in the 1970s, the Society for the Preservation of Long Island Antiquities compiled this brief survey, which some of you may have seen, survey of octagon-shaped buildings throughout Long Island. It doesn't show the Weeks house in Yaphank, which I added on the upper right, and it doesn't show the octagon-shaped schoolhouse that was built in Yaphank, which I have pictured on the lower right. But it does show an octagon-shaped building in Oyster Bay, which is interesting considering that the Weekses were married. The Weekses were from Oyster Bay and were married into families from the Cold Spring Harbor area. But the survey also points out the Octagon House in Brentwood, and which they identify as the Christ Church Rectory in this, which is, admittedly out of date because this is from 1974. So they have the Dame House pictured here, and they also have, I believe they have the schoolhouse pictured here as well. Let me see. Yes, the schoolhouse is 4 and the rectory is 5, I believe. So the designs of octagon-shaped houses are historically associated with the home health movements, and their archaeological remains may provide a window to the daily health concerns of their residents. And one aspect of this is the development of infrastructure features within the homes, like pipes, water pumps, tanks, toilets, and boilers, some of which are discussed in Fowler's book. And I'm showing you this picture here, not just to show you the archaeologists at work in the field, but if you look to the left background, it's kind of hard to see, but there was this square bump out, which is also built off with fieldstone granite. And in there is where the remains of the pump house were. So an archaeological investigation in there would be really important, to shed light on how these archaeological features were built into, octagon-shaped homes, either in extensions or as central features of the house when they were built initially. In addition to those kinds of features, we might look for things like medicinal and water bottles, home health and personal grooming artifacts, and food remains, all of which would provide a basis for interpreting human lived experience and home health activities, as well as dietary choices. So for the weeks, we would expect not to find any animal bone because they were vegetarians. But I think there's also this very curious connection between the presence of octagon-shaped houses, social reform, and radical politics. And there are apparently some really strong links between utopians' ideas about architecture and correlates with topics like phrenology, spiritualism, anarchism, land reform, vegetarianism, and abolitionism. And the material remains of these ideals are apparent in, of all things, the construction of geometric residences and planned communities, such as octagonal houses, hexagonal planning, and even street grids. And there's a very curious connection between the presence of, of these types in Brentwood, which is why I was so interested in presenting to you today, because I hope it will generate a greater discussion between me and your organization about how we can pursue these research topics. It's interesting that so many of these features are prominent markers of modern times. The original street grid, the remodeled home of Josiah Warren, which I don't have photographed here, but also the 2 19th century octagonal structures, which I understand the schoolhouse is under a long-term restoration project. But we have pictured here the Dame House, which looks like it's been fully restored and is part of the Sisters of St. Joseph's Academy. I looked into the CRIS system to see how these structures are documented in the State Historic Preservation site files. And it's noted that there's, there's a National Register listed site that the Dame House is a contributing part of. But I thought it was interesting that the Dame House isn't marked individually in the CRIS system, which I think it should be. And I think we should let the State Historic Preservation Office know that greater attention needs to be paid to some of these Brentwood resources. One of the architectural historians that I'm reading right now argues that reformers looked to things like architecture and urban plans because of an emerging ideology of environmental determinism. This idea that architecture and landscape could not only represent its inhabitants, but also molds individuals' bodies and minds. And as a result, the physical design of many kinds of spaces, from prisons to asylums to houses and to gardens, came to be seen in the late 18th and early 19th centuries as having really powerful impact to shape both individual bodies and social collectivities. So to draw all of this back to Long Island dirt, what I'm really interested in is how diverse communities across Long Island gave rise to distinct identities that Long Islanders are so conscious of in the present. So this work ultimately feels like I'm compiling short stories of history told through the method and interpretive power of historical archaeology and its sources. And I'm continuing to explore the relationship that Weeks and the Smiths families have at Yaphank. Let's see here. The relationships they maintained with families in Cold Spring Harbor and Oyster Bay. Because the Weeks families were really deeply entangled in kin, but also in corporate ventures that are located in both of these locations. And those relationships have really strong implications for labor forces. But I'm also interested in the material connections between Yaphank and Brentwood. I'm interested in looking at what kinds of similarities, what kinds of differences, what kinds of connections can be made between the settlements. Like for instance, in both locations, the railroad seemed to be a really important factor. But in modern times, and Brentwood, which comes later, I think that the railroad plays a really important part in people locating an area to settle, but it didn't necessarily drive the settlement. Whereas in Wampmissick and Yaphank and Manorville, the railroad was less tied to the development of a settlement and more tied to industry. I think it's interesting that in both places you have octagon houses, and in both places you also have the later institutions of social reform. In Yaphank, we have the Alms House that's developed, the Suffolk County Alms House, which Weeks is actually a strong proponent of. And then in Brentwood, you have the Pilgrim Psychiatric Center, but there's a big gap in time between the mid to late 19th century and then development of the Pilgrim Psych Center in the first quarter of the 20th century. So what happens in between there, and how do the ideas of social reform remain vested in the community? There's certainly big differences in settlement structure. Modern times is more focused on freedom through land tenure, where Yaphank is still very much tied to ideals of the estates and the landed gentry and the maintenance of wealth through real estate. So this is a significant difference that can be seen in the landscape around the Weeks Octagon House as well, and can be explored through archaeology. So I hope that this presentation has opened a new line of communication with you all. And I hope it also encourages you to reach out to the Yaphank Historical Society to build connections on the shared pasts through architecture and social reform at Yaphank and Brentwood. And that is all. And I want to thank you for listening. And I'm going to, so I have on the screen here my contact information in case anybody wants to get in touch with me.
Well, I want to thank you, Allison. This was very interesting. I'm always a little jolted when I see that photograph of the schoolhouse, because that's not, it is the schoolhouse, but it's not when it was a schoolhouse. Photograph that is published is a photograph when it was a private residence.
In the Splia inventory, in that picture of the Splia inventory?
With all the frills on it and the curly cues and such.
Yeah,
Classic picture of the schoolhouse. And in the process of the restoration, that will not be included because that's not what it looked like originally.
That's good.
It did have an alcove in the front that looked somewhat like the extension of the house in Yaphank. Not quite as large, and this is only a one-story structure versus multi-story, but that alcove has been put back onto the building, and the schoolhouse is on the National Register. I don't know why you didn't come across it.
I know. So that's one of the things that I wanted to show you, I mean, I guess it's getting kind of late now, but in the cultural resources information system, they have what it's sort of like a district or a site for St. Joseph's Academy. And well, I know that the schoolhouse has been moved. So where is it located now?
Now it's located on 3rd Avenue. It's on the property of the Brentwood School District where the administration building is.
Okay, okay.
So it's in that, and it had been moved prior to its inclusion in the National Register, but because of its significance, they made an exception. There was some sort of covenant agreed to that even though it was in a new location, it was within a close enough distance
Mm-hmm.
of the original location, because actually the library is where the schoolhouse was.
Oh, okay, okay.
The school,
Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to screenshot the CRIS system to show you if it's placed, first of all, if it's identified individually, because it didn't appear to be identified individually. And if it's plotted in the right location. Because
are you talking about the Dame House or the schoolhouse?
No, the schoolhouse, because the schoolhouse, it doesn't even look like it's documented in the CRIS system.
Well, it should be, because I have the paperwork.
Okay. Yeah, well, and that's important, right? I mean, it's not an error on, it's an error on the State Historic Preservation Office's side. Because
it bypassed the state and went directly to the federal. It's on the National Historic, and it may have bypassed the state. It was done prior to me, about 1992, I believe.
Okay.
But I do have paperwork on that. And as far as the Dame House being included, it's a property of the Sisters of St. Joseph, but it's not contiguous property. And the campus was just recently put onto the National Register, and I don't know what the protocols for including the Dame House would be under those circumstances.
So I got that National Register nomination form off of the CRIS system, and it seems weird to me because it's not listed as a district, it's listed as a site, but it specifies that it's something weird about the properties being contributing. It has a list of all of the buildings that are considered part of the site, and the Dame House is one of them. But the way they identify them is not as contributing to a district. I think they consider it as a whole, like all the structures and the property as a whole as a site, which is different. I mean, I think I don't know why they did it that way. Do you know, you don't know who did the National Register nomination form?
I believe it was Zach Studenroth was involved.
Oh, okay.
His name is on the nomination form.
Oh, it is? Okay, yeah. He was working on the one in Yaphank.
I know.
Too. So.
But yeah, I come across the paperwork periodically as I go through my things, and I said, got to put this in a place where it's easily obtainable. It's copies of things, but they're stamped and they're certified. So at this point, I am going to thank you. I'm going to stop the recording so that we can go to a Q&A if people care to do so.
Thank you.